They mocked the trembling librarian, unaware she was a ghost from MI6. They didn't just trap an old woman. They woke up the sleeping lion. The relentless ticking of the mahogany clock on the wall was the heartbeat of the St. Jude Public Library. It was a rhythmic, soothing sound that Mrs. Eleanor Gable had listened to for 15 years. At 72, Eleanor was a fixture of the place, woven into the fabric of the building just like the smell of old parchment, vanilla binding glue, and floor wax. She was small, with hair the color of steel wool pulled back into a severe bun, and oversized spectacles that made her eyes look like magnified, watery pools of blue. To the locals, she was the lady who brought hard butterscotch candies for the children and scolded teenagers with nothing more than a disappointed purse of her lips. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the quietest time of the week. Outside, the autumn wind whipped dead leaves against the stained glass windows, but inside, the air was still. Dust motes danced in the shafts of golden light piercing the upper clerestory. Eleanor stood behind the circulation desk, her arthritic fingers moving with a practiced, albeit slow, rhythm as she repaired the spine of a worn copy of Great Expectations. She loved the tactile sensation of the book tape, the precision required to mend something broken. It was a sharp contrast to her former life, a life she had buried under decades of silence and dewy decimal numbers. In the children's section, nestled within a fortress of beanbag chairs, was 10-year-old Leo. He was a latchkey kid, a regular who waited there every day until his mother finished her shift at the diner across the street. Leo was reading about sharks, completely absorbed in the world of apex predators. Eleanor smiled softly at the sight of him. He was the reason she kept the library open 10 minutes late some days. He was innocent, a blank page in a world that was often scribbled over with darkness. The library was a sanctuary. It was a temple of silence where the chaos of the modern world was not allowed to enter. People came here to escape, to learn, and to breathe. Eleanor took a sip of her Earl Grey tea, the porcelain cup rattling slightly against the saucer due to the tremor in her hands. It was a peaceful tremor, simply age catching up to her. Or so everyone thought. She adjusted her cardigan, feeling the chill of the drafty building, and looked over the rows of books that stood like silent soldiers. For Eleanor, this peace wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a hard-won luxury. It was the silence after a lifetime of screaming. But as she watched the heavy oak doors at the entrance, a subtle shift in the atmosphere made the hair on her arms stand up. The peace was about to shatter. The heavy oak doors didn't just open. They were kicked in with a violence that shook the dust from the rafters. The sound was like a gunshot, cracking through the serene silence of the library and causing Leo to jump so hard he dropped his book. The peace that Eleanor had so carefully cultivated evaporated instantly, replaced by the jarring, abrasive energy of the intruders. 3 of them stormed in, bringing the cold, biting wind of the street with them. They were young, perhaps in their early 20s, but their eyes held a hardened, predatory glint that spoke of a life devoid of consequences. They were known as the Blackout Crew, a group of local anarchists and thugs who had been terrorizing the downtown district for months. They wore heavy boots that clacked aggressively against the hardwood floors, and their laughter was loud, jagged, and cruel. They weren't here to read. They were here to break things. They were here because they were running from a siren that wailed in the distance, and they needed a place to lay low and assert dominance. The leader, a wiry man with a neck tattoo of a scorpion, vaulted over a display table, sending a stack of new releases crashing to the floor. "Quiet time is over, Grandma," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He picked up a heavy encyclopedia and hurled it across the room. It slammed into a bookshelf, tearing the cover. Eleanor didn't flinch visibly, but her heart rate didn't spike either. She watched them with a detached curiosity. Behind the leader were 2 others, a hulking brute wearing a torn denim vest and a skittish, twitchy girl with dyed red hair who was spinning a butterfly knife in her fingers. They spread out, knocking over chairs and ripping posters from the walls. They were claiming the space, marking it with chaos. "Hey! Anyone home?" the brute yelled, kicking a beanbag chair. Leo, terrified, scrambled backward, trying to hide behind a shelf of biographies. The brute spotted him and grinned. "Look what we found. A little bookworm." Leo let out a stifled cry as the brute loomed over him. The terror in the boy's eyes was absolute. This wasn't just noise anymore. This was a threat. The library, once a fortress, now felt like a trap. The sirens outside faded, moving in the wrong direction. The police weren't coming here. They were on their own. Eleanor griped the edge of the circulation desk, her knuckles turning white. She watched the brute reach out and grab Leo by the collar of his shirt, lifting the boy onto his toes. "Leave him alone." Eleanor's voice came out, sounding frail and wavering. The leader spun around, mocking surprise. "Oh, she speaks. I thought you were a statue, lady. Sit down and shut up or we'll start burning the books." The terror was thick in the air, a suffocating blanket that paralyzed the few other patrons in the back. But in Eleanor's mind, the terror was data. It was input, and she was processing it fast. Eleanor stood frozen behind the desk, or at least, that's what she projected to the room. Inside, the intricate machinery of her mind was revving up, dusting off gears that hadn't turned since the Cold War. She looked down at the circulation desk, specifically at a small, framed photograph tucked behind her computer monitor. It was a black and white photo of a man standing in front of a foggy bridge in London. He looked kind but tired. That was Arthur, her late husband. He had been the one to pull her out of the circus, out of the psychological warfare unit of MI6. He had promised her a life of quiet, of books, of tea. He had promised she would never have to open that door in her mind again. "I promised you, Arthur," she thought, her finger brushing the edge of the frame. "I promised no more games. No more breaking minds." But then she looked up. The brute was shaking Leo now, laughing as the boy sobbed. The girl with the red hair was lighting a cigarette, flicking the ash onto the pristine carpet, disrespecting the sanctity of the one place Eleanor loved. The leader was pacing, his aggression escalating. He wasn't just a hooligan. He was a sadist looking for an outlet. If she did nothing, the violence would spiral. They would hurt the boy. They might burn the place down. Eleanor closed her eyes for a microsecond. She breathed in the smell of old paper and exhaled the persona of the frail librarian. She felt the tremor in her hands. It was real, a symptom of her age, but she knew how to bypass the hardware when the software was this good. She focused on the tremor, acknowledged it, and then mentally shoved it into a box. When she opened her eyes, the watery blue softness was gone. In its place was a flat, clinical gray. The eyes of a woman who had once sat across from defectors and terrorists and made them weep without ever laying a finger on them. The tremble didn't stop physically, but the intent behind it changed. It was no longer weakness. It was camouflage. She reached into her pocket and touched a smooth, cold object, a commemorative coin from her service days. Periculum in mora. Danger in delay. She made the choice. The librarian was checking out. The analyst was checking in. She didn't need a gun. She didn't need youth. She knew exactly what these three were. The leader was a narcissist, desperate for control. The brute was a follower, dependent on the leader's approval. The girl was anxious, arguably the most dangerous because she was unpredictable. Eleanor stepped out from behind the desk. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She adjusted her glasses and began to walk. The choice was made. The sleeping lion had woken up, and it was hungry. Eleanor moved into the open space of the reading room. To the onlookers, it was a suicide run. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of overturning tables and the looming figures of the thugs. She hunched her shoulders forward, exaggerating the curvature of her spine, and allowed her feet to shuffle audibly against the floor. Scuff, scuff, scuff. The sound was pathetic, annoying, and entirely non-threatening. It was the Trojan horse, a visual display of harmlessness designed to lower the enemy's guard. "Please," Eleanor bleated, her voice cracking perfectly. She held her hands up, palms open, shaking visibly. "Please, young men. You're scaring the child. We don't want any trouble." The leader, the man with the scorpion tattoo, turned and laughed. It was a barking, cruel sound. He abandoned a pile of magazines he was tearing up and strutted toward her, puffing out his chest. He saw exactly what she wanted him to see. A victim. A fragile old biddy who should be in a nursing home, not interfering with his fun. Trouble. The leader sneered, getting right in her face. He smelled of stale tobacco and cheap energy drinks. "Lady, we are the trouble. You get that. Now get back in your cage." Eleanor didn't retreat. She took a tiny, stumbling step closer, invading his personal space just enough to be annoying, but not enough to trigger a fight response, yet. She looked up at him, her head tilting to the side like a confused bird. I just want to make sure everyone is safe," she stammered. "I can make you tea. We have biscuits in the back. Just, please let the boy go." The brute, still holding Leo, guffawed. "Tea? She wants to give us tea, boss." The leader grinned, lowering his guard completely. His ego was being fed. He felt powerful dominating this helpless creature. "I don't want your tea, Grandma. I want your wallet. I want the cash from the register. And then maybe we'll have some fun with the books." Eleanor's eyes darted to the girl with the knife, then to the brute, calculating the distance. 7 meters to the brute. 4 to the girl. 0 to the leader. She needed to isolate the leader's mind before she broke his body. She needed to separate the pack. "You look so tired," Eleanor said, her voice shifting slightly. It wasn't the stammering old lady anymore, though she kept the volume low. It was maternal, yet eerie. "You look like you're running from something terrible. Is it the police? Or is it your father?" The leader blinked, the smile faltering for a split second. "What did you say?" Eleanor shuffled closer, her hand reaching out as if to pat his arm. It was a grandmotherly gesture, but her fingers were positioned over the ulnar nerve cluster. She was close enough to whisper now. The Trojan horse was inside the gates. The leader recoiled slightly from her touch, his aggression spiking. "Don't touch me, you old hag," he spat, raising his hand to shove her backward. He expected her to crumble. He expected her to fall into a heap of knitted wool and brittle bones. But she didn't fall. As his hand came down, Eleanor didn't block it. She stepped into it. She moved with a fluidity that defied physics for a woman of her age. She slipped inside his guard, her body acting as a fulcrum. And then she spoke. She leaned up, her face inches from his ear, and the grandmotherly mask dissolved. The voice that came out was not the voice of Mrs. Gable. It was a voice from the basement of MI6, a tone pitch perfected to bypass the conscious brain and strike directly at the amygdala, the fear center. It was a subsonic, guttural whisper, flat and devoid of humanity. "If you move again, I will collapse your trachea before your brain realizes you can't breathe." The psychological pressure of that voice, so calm, so authoritative, so utterly at odds with her appearance, caused the leader's brain to short-circuit. He froze. It was a primal freeze response. In that second of paralysis, Eleanor acted. Her trembling hand snapped onto his wrist. It wasn't a grab. It was a vice. She found the pressure point and twisted. The leader's eyes bulged. He tried to scream, but the pain was so sharp and immediate it sucked the air out of his lungs. Eleanor pivoted on her heel, using the leader's own body weight against him. With a sharp, efficient torque of her hips, she executed a perfect Osoto-gari throw. Wham! The leader hit the hardwood floor with a bone-rattling thud. The air left him in a wheezing gasp. Before he could scramble up, Eleanor was standing over him. She didn't look like a librarian anymore. Her posture was straight, her chin tucked. She stomped, not hard, but with surgical precision, on the inside of his knee. A sickening pop echoed through the library. The leader curled into a fetal ball, whimpering. The library went deathly silent. The brute dropped Leo. The girl with the red hair froze, her butterfly knife hanging loosely in her hand. They stared at the old woman who was adjusting her cardigan as if she had just swatted a fly. Eleanor looked up at the remaining two, her glasses sliding down her nose slightly. She pushed them back up with a single finger. "Sure," she whispered, putting a finger to her lips. The sound carried across the room like a crack of a whip. "This is a library." The shock lasted only 3 seconds. That was the standard recovery time for an untrained combatant witnessing the impossible. The brute, realizing his leader was writhing on the floor, roared in a mix of confusion and rage. He abandoned Leo and charged. He was a freight train of muscle, lacking technique but compensating with sheer mass. The girl with the red hair, panicked and reactive, flicked her knife open and began to circle wide, cutting off Eleanor's escape route to the exit. "Leo, run to the archives," Eleanor commanded. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was a field order. Sharp, clear, commanding. Leo, galvanized by the sudden transformation of the nice candy lady into a warrior, scrambled up and sprinted toward the heavy metal door at the back of the library. Eleanor didn't wait for the brute to reach her. She knew she couldn't take a direct hit from a man that size. Her bones were too old to absorb the impact. She had to use the environment. She grabbed the heavy, rolling library cart filled with encyclopedias standing next to her. With a grunt of exertion, she shoved it forward. The cart rolled on well-oiled wheels, gaining speed. The brute, blinded by rage, didn't check his momentum. He collided with the metal cart shin first. He howled as he tumbled over it, crashing into a display of globes. "Get the kids!" Everyone behind the desk. Eleanor shouted to the few frozen patrons, a mother with a toddler and an elderly man reading the paper. They scrambled, sensing that Eleanor was their only hope. The girl with the knife lunged. She was faster than the men. She slashed at Eleanor's arm. Eleanor sucked in a breath, twisting her body away, but the blade caught the sleeve of her cardigan, slicing the wool and grazing the skin. A line of red appeared. Eleanor didn't look at the wound. She backed up, retreating toward the archive door where Leo had fled. She grabbed a heavy leather-bound dictionary from a nearby table and held it like a shield. The brute was getting up. The leader was trying to stand on one leg, cursing. More shouting came from outside. "More of them," Eleanor muttered, analyzing the noise. The blackout crew wasn't just 3 people. It was a swarm. She could hear tires screeching and doors slamming. The library was about to be overrun. She reached the archive door, ushered the civilians inside, and stood in the doorway. She looked at the 3 villains in the main hall. "Come any closer," she said, her voice dropping back to that terrifyingly calm register, "and I will teach you the difference between a tragedy and a horror story." She slammed the heavy steel door and locked it. They were barricaded. But they were trapped. The archives room was a windowless vault, temperature-controlled and smelling of vinegar and decaying leather. It housed the town's historical records and rare manuscripts. It was also the most defensible room in the building. Leo was crying in the corner. The young mother was rocking her toddler, her eyes wide with panic. Eleanor didn't offer empty platitudes. She went into work mode. She dragged a heavy shelving unit across the door, wedging it under the handle. The banging on the other side started immediately. Heavy, rhythmic thuds. They were trying to break it down. "Leo," Eleanor said, kneeling beside the boy. She ignored the blood trickling down her arm. "Look at me." Leo looked up, sniffling. "Do you know why the lion is the king of the jungle?" she asked, her voice steady. Because he's strong?" Leo stammered. "No," Eleanor shook her head. "Because he knows when to be still. Strength is noise. Power is silence." She stood up and turned to the room. "Listen to me. They are going to try to scare you. They will scream. They will bang on the door. But they cannot get in unless we let them. We are going to make this room a fortress." She moved quickly. She knew the layout of this room better than her own home. She pointed to a cabinet labeled preservation supplies. "Open that. Take out the ethanol and the cleaning ammonia." She turned to the elderly man. "Help me stack these books. We need a maze. If they breach the door, they must not have a straight line of sight." Eleanor began to construct traps. She wasn't building bombs. She was building distractions. She poured the ammonia onto a rag and placed it near the ventilation intake by the door. "Chemical warfare," she muttered. "Primitive but effective." She scattered marbles from a jar of decorative stones across the floor near the entrance. The banging grew louder. A crack appeared in the doorframe. "They are coming," the mother whispered, clutching her child. "Let them come," Eleanor said, picking up a heavy brass bookend shaped like a griffin. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the history of the town. She looked at the civilians. "I need you all to hide behind the backstacks. Cover your ears. Close your eyes. Do not make a sound until I tell you." She turned to the door. Her arthritis was burning, her wound was stinging, but her mind was crystal clear. She wasn't Mrs. Gable anymore. She was Agent 00 Winter. She waited. She controlled her breathing, lowering her heart rate. She prepared to teach these hooligans a final lesson. You never corner a librarian who knows where the bodies are buried. The hinges screamed in protest before giving way. The heavy steel door of the archives buckled, then swung open, scraping loudly against the shelving unit Eleanor had wedged there. The barricade held for a moment, then toppled under the combined weight of the brute and two new attackers who had joined the fray. The air in the room instantly filled with the scent of unwashed bodies and aggression, mixing poorly with the sharp tang of ammonia Eleanor had prepped. The thugs coughed, eyes watering, but they pushed through. There were 5 of them now. Too many for a 70-year-old woman to fight in close quarters. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the maze of books she had constructed. She held the brass griffin, but she lowered it. She did the math. The civilians were hidden, but if a fight broke out here, stray bullets or sheer chaos would find them. The leader, limping heavily and supported by the red-haired girl, hobbled into the room. His face was a mask of pure hatred. He had a gun now, a cheap silver pistol. "You," he hissed, pointing the weapon at her chest. "You broke my knee." "I spared your life," Eleanor corrected him, her voice calm. "A mistake I am beginning to regret." The brute stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Let me snap her, boss." Eleanor looked at the gun, then back toward the stacks where Leo and the others were hiding. She saw Leo's sneaker peeking out. If they started shooting, the bullets would rip through the paper and hit the boy. Calculated risk. Probability of survival in a shootout. 0%. Probability of survival if she de-escalated by surrender. 15%. Eleanor dropped the brass bookend. It clattered loudly on the floor. She raised her hands slowly. "Stop," she said. "The children are of no value to you. The police are already surrounding the building. You can hear the sirens." Indeed, the sirens were close now, screeching to a halt outside. Blue and red lights flashed against the high windows. "I am the hostage you want," Eleanor stated, stepping forward, over the marbles she had scattered. "I am the one who hurt you. I am the only one the police will trade for. Let the civilians go. Take me." The leader sneered. "You think you're in a movie, Grandma? We're taking everyone." "If you take them," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to that icy whisper again, "you slow yourself down. You need a human shield to get to your car. Just one. Me." She tapped her chest. "I'm old. I'm frail. The police won't shoot an old lady. I'm your ticket out." The leader hesitated. The logic was sound. He was in pain, panic was setting in, and he needed an exit. He motioned with the gun. "Grab her." The brute lunged, grabbing Eleanor by her hair and twisting her arm behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder, hot and blinding. She gritted her teeth but didn't cry out. "Let the others go," the leader barked. "We take the witch." As they dragged her out of the archives, Eleanor glanced back at the dark corner where Leo was hiding. "Stay down," she willed him. "Stay quiet." She was the offering. The lamb walking into the slaughterhouse. But wolves often forgot that a lamb could have teeth. The main hall of the library was awash in the strobe light chaos of police cruisers outside. A megaphone blared, demanded surrender. The leader, sweating profusely and high on adrenaline, dragged Eleanor toward the front doors. He used her body as a shield, pressing the cold barrel of the pistol against her temple. "Back off," he screamed at the glass doors, "or I paint the walls with her brains." Outside, SWAT teams were taking positions behind cruisers. Red laser dots danced on the library walls, searching for a target. But Eleanor's small frame was completely eclipsed by the leader and the brute. They couldn't take the shot. Eleanor felt the leader's pulse against her back. It was erratic, rapid. He was terrifyingly close to pulling the trigger just out of a reflex spasm. She had to act before they exited the building. Once they were outside, she was dead. "Your hand is shaking," Eleanor whispered. It was barely audible, meant only for him. "Shut up," he screamed, jabbing the gun harder. "You're going to miss," she whispered again, injecting a specific cadence into her words, a hypnotic rhythm she had used in interrogation rooms in Belfast and Berlin. "You're weak. Your knee is shattered. You're going to fall." I said shut up. "Look at the sniper," she lied. "To your left. He sees you." The leader's head jerked reflexively to the left. No. Eleanor didn't fight his strength. She exploited his distraction. She dropped her entire body weight, going completely limp. It was a deadweight drop. Surprised, the leader's grip slipped on her sweaty cardigan. As she fell, she didn't just hit the floor. She drove her elbow backward, straight into his groin. The leader doubled over, the gun firing wildly into the ceiling. Bang! In the chaos, Eleanor didn't scramble away. She rolled onto her back and kicked upward, her heel driving into the leader's shattered knee. He screamed and collapsed. "Breaching! Breaching!" The police radio chatter exploded. The glass doors shattered as SWAT teams poured in. The brute tried to raise his weapon, but Eleanor was already moving. From her position on the floor, she grabbed a discarded hardcover book, War and Peace, thick and heavy, and swung it with both hands. The corner of the book connected with the leader's temple just as he tried to raise the gun again. He went down and stayed down. "Drop it. Get down." SWAT officers swarmed the room. Eleanor lay amidst the broken glass and scattered books. Her arm was bleeding, her bun was unraveled, and her glasses were cracked. A laser sight swept over her. "Secure!" an officer yelled, kicking the gun away from the unconscious leader. An armored officer knelt beside Eleanor. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you hear me?" Eleanor blinked, the adrenaline fading, leaving her exhausted. She looked at the officer, her blue eyes wide and watery again. The wolf was retreating. The librarian was returning. I think I've lost my glasses," she whispered, her voice trembling. This time the tremble was real. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights and yellow tape. Paramedics tended to Eleanor's arm on the back of an ambulance. She sat wrapped in a shock blanket, sipping a cup of lukewarm water. The blackout crew was being loaded into paddy wagons, battered and broken. Captain Miller, the head of the local precinct, walked over to the ambulance. He was a veteran cop, cynical and tired. He held a tablet in his hand, looking at a file that had just been unsealed by a federal override. He looked at the file, then at the little old lady shivering on the bumper. "Mrs. Gable?" Miller asked, his tone skeptical. Eleanor looked up. "Yes, officer. We ran your prints. Standard procedure for witnesses." Miller lowered his voice, leaning in close. Nothing came up in the civilian database. But a flag popped up from a server in London. Something called File 88. Eleanor smiled sadly. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Computers make mistakes, Captain. I'm just a librarian." Miller looked at the unconscious gang leader being wheeled past. "That kid has a shattered knee, a collapsed windpipe, and signs of psychological trauma. You took down 4 armed men with a book cart and a dictionary. Who are you really?" Eleanor stood up. She folded the shock blanket neatly. "I told you, Captain. I'm a librarian. I ensure things are quiet." She looked past him to where Leo was hugging his mother. The boy looked over and waved. Eleanor waved back. "I have to go," she said. "Ma'am, I can't just let you leave." "The feds are on the phone," Miller said, reaching for her arm. Eleanor gave him a look. It wasn't the wolf look, but it was close enough to make a seasoned police captain hesitate. "Let it be, Captain. The lion is going back to sleep. Don't wake it up." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of onlookers. When Miller looked down at his tablet again to check the file, the screen blinked and went black. File deleted. By the time he looked up, Mrs. Gable was gone. The library reopened 2 weeks later. The books were repaired. The silence returned. But every now and then, when the rowdy teenagers got too loud, they would look at the empty chair behind the circulation desk, remember the legend of the sleeping lion, and decide to whisper instead.